let's start it off. In 1945, China had been plunged back into civil war after the defeat of the Japanese. However, the communists had made a huge comeback, as they had almost been destroyed right before World War II. During World War II, they really prospered. They had a really organized military. You should check out the Long March for more details on that. It is a really interesting story. So the communists defeated the Kuomintang, who retreated to Taiwan. The communists therefore were able to take mainland China and claimed it as the People's Republic of China in October 1st, 1949. So this guy right here on the screen is Mao Zedong. He began centralizing power at this time and redistributing property to the lower classes. In 1950, China joined the North Koreans against America, and almost all foreigners left China. This is a very important part of Chinese history, as they had begun training and planning for their invasion of Taiwan. The communists implemented many harsh revisions during this time, practically removing private business and nationalizing industry. In 1953, China mimicked the Soviet Union's 5-year plan, which helped their economy. However, the next attempt, which was called the Great Leap Forward, was not so much. China used grain exports to pay for machinery from the USSR. So this seems very smart, except that they needed that grain to feed their population, and this killed roughly 20 million, with an M, people between 1959 and 1962, as most food was really distributed primarily for trade. Then Mao Zedong did the Cultural Revolution, which young students swelled the Red Guard and practically destroyed anything of historical or cultural significance or thought that was still around in China. They literally ripped people out of their houses and killed them in the streets to kind of redistribute power throughout the country, power and money. So yeah, while this was devastating to the population, it was a very powerful power play from Mao to consolidate power, and it kind of worked, which was crazy. So Mao was responsible for the murder of roughly 40 million people over his reign until 1976. So we shift from Mao to this guy right here, Deng Xiaoping. He had this very famous saying, "It doesn't matter if the cat is black or white, so long as it catches mice." So he actually changed things to a more capitalist-style economy. So he had 4 goals: agriculture, industry, defense, and technology. Agriculture grew by over 50%. No more communes, peasant farms, things like that. Industry, the state required a part of an industry, and then whatever was remained, whatever else was made during that time period went towards the workers as extra wages. So it kind of gave them an incentive. It was a communist concept, but it kind of had a capitalist ideal in it. So then goal number 3 was defense. So he grew the nuclear arsenal. The military shifted from a guerrilla force to a traditional military, which is pretty important because China has always had a guerrilla force military up until this point. And then, well, modern China, or the communist China. Technology was focused on. They created a space program, schools, etc. He also, to prevent food shortages from returning to China, promoted a one-child policy. The unexpected outcome was foreign influence in China, mainly concerning democracy, and this came up in 1989 during a student protest in Tiananmen Square, very similar to the Cultural Revolution, where the young rose up to do things, and they expected to make big changes in China. The government acted drastically, ordering soldiers to attack the crowd, killing organizers and leaders of the movement, and this created more censorship in China. It's pretty devastating to China's economy and China's international recognition. So internationally, China and the USSR had been strong allies after World War II. However, this began to fade in the late 50s, and the two began to distrust each other's motives. In 1969, China and the USSR had a border dispute which caused a major shift in allegiance. During the 70s, China began to lean towards relations with the U.S. China would eventually join the United Nations, which is a whole story in itself, which is pretty interesting. Uh, the the United Nations recognized Taiwan, that group that had run, the Kuomintang, who had run from China after the communists defeated them. And we recognize that as China, even though it was a very small island off the coast. It's very messed up. However, China never was able to take Taiwan because they shifted their military towards Korea during the Korean War, which we'll talk about later. So in 1997, Hong Kong was returned to China, and as you know from recent news stories, this was a huge issue because you have two very different groups of people living together under the same country now. By 2010, China overtook Japan and became the second largest economy. China has become the second largest economy on the planet and one of the most powerful nations today. We will talk a lot more about China this semester. Alright, so now on to Japan. Japan was forced to surrender at the end of World War II, bringing its years of Asian dominance to an end, a very short end at that. The time immediately after the war was the years of American occupation under General MacArthur. Japan was an important location to help push back communist influence in the world. This is why capitalism and democracy were the main goals of the Allies after the war. And you'll see this as you look into the people who were brought up on war crimes and how many of them got away with really atrocious actions during the war. So after losing the territories gained and experiencing an influx of the Japanese who had been living there, Japan experienced a massive food shortage. Civil government was mostly kept intact. The emperor was kept almost immune to war crimes and punishment, as the Americans wanted to win over the Japanese people, using the emperor as kind of a symbol of keeping the old but still revising some of the recent changes. The military leaders and prime minister took all the blame. So this made reforms easier as the emperor supported most of the changes. The U.S. Had three problems: demilitarization, economic reforms, and social reforms. Many social reforms were passed. Women were allowed to vote in 1946. Farms were pretty much sold for dirt cheap to farmers. Large monopolies were dissolved and industry shifted away from military means. In April 46, the first elections took place for their prime minister. The defense money shifted directly towards the economy, which just drastically boosted its economy. Power was given back to Japan in 1949, and the Americans left by 1952. Between 52 and 90, the Japanese economy would boom to one of the world's largest producers of electronics and other goods. However, this does not last as progress slows between 90 to 92 after the stock market crashes. Small progress is made in 97. The Japanese economy once again enters a recession. And in 2006, Japan creates a defense ministry, which is a pretty big move as it's its first military concept since World War II. And this is to offset future conflicts with China. Now, Japan did have a military deployment in 2004 in Iraq with American forces, but they now have an actual domestic military command structure. 2009, Japan's economy has reached its lowest shrinkage since World War II. Later that year, the political party holding office for more than 50 years loses power. And in 2011, Japan falls to into third behind China's economy. And later that year, a tsunami causes the Fukushima nuclear disaster. The Japanese economy begins to leave the recession in 2015, which brings us to roughly today. So we will come back to Japan on another week. Now to the main battle for today, or the main concept. Just a few more notes from Japan. Korea. So, the end of World War II marks the end of Japanese occupation of Korea, and as it shifted into the USSR, America, and China for a very small time. The night after the Japanese surrendered to the U.S., Korea was under invasion from the north by communist USSR soldiers. U.S. Army officers Dean Rusk and Charles Bonesteel sat down with nothing more than a National Geographic map of Asia and determined that the U.S. and the USSR would split the country on the 38th parallel. I would just like to add, this is a true story and whiskey was involved. This would make the capital of the South Seoul and the North Pyongyang. The intention was elections would occur and the population would decide whether the peninsula was democratic or communist. However, by August 15, 1948, the Republic of Korea in the south and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea were established in the north. So Kim Il-sung, the man in the picture, a Korean born in a refugee camp in Russia, had been fighting against the Japanese for many years. He began building up the Korean military. The North had experienced very little destruction at the end of World War II, and Japan had actually expected this territory to stay under Japanese ownership, and so they had heavily industrialized this region. I mean, it had a very booming economy. This is the opposite of the South, which had pretty much just very poor infrastructure and farmland. And on June 25th, 1950, the North Koreans crossed the border and drove the very few U.S. And UN soldiers that were stationed there, as well as the Korean Defense Force, to the farthest southeast region called Pusan, which created the Pusan perimeter. Let me pull that up right here. This is a map of what happened during the war. So, this would be known as the Pusan perimeter and would be the only thing that kept the South Koreans in the fight until American forces came from Japan under the command of General Douglas MacArthur. With the support of aircraft carriers and air supremacy, the South's forces were able to quickly turn the tide using a classic pincer movement routine to take Korea back. But then they pushed the North Koreans past the 38th parallel all the way to the Yalu River, and during this time, the Chinese crossed the border and entered the war with the support of Russian fighters and Russian fighter jets, which were new, the MiGs, which definitely had a better system than the American planes of the time. This was called the MiG corridor, which gave the Chinese, Russians, and North Koreans air supremacy. So the UN forces were utterly unprepared for this. They were outnumbered, outmatched, and they had a massive retreat. Thousands died on both sides. It was a very, very harsh time period for the West and, in all honesty, for those fighting in the East. By 1951, Seoul had changed hands 4 times. New lines had begun to stagnate. And then with the death of Stalin in 1953 and no progress made on either side of the Korean War, it just ended. There was an armistice signed, and the lines were roughly where they started, but I think the North actually took a little bit more than they lost. So Korea was, by the end of the war, the South experienced massive destructions. The North had no buildings standing at all. We ran out of targets for our bombers in the North. I mean, it was very sad. Korea was a broken and destroyed peninsula as the result of foreign powers once again. The two Koreas would take different paths, the North sticking with communism, the South going capitalist and democratic. However, they really were not as democratic as one would imagine. And let's get into that. So the U.S. had left many of those Koreans in power from the Japanese occupation. And in 1961, Major General Park Chung-hee, with a small number of soldiers, overthrew the government in a coup. The North had threatened to invade again, and fears were pretty high. The military took power of the entirety of the government in order to redirect their dying nation. Park would eventually be voted into power 5 times until his assassination in 1979. 7 5-year phases of reform were outlined. but the U.S. ended its aid under JFK. In order to gain the much-needed money to reform the government, West Germany hired many Korean workers, which funded more than 2% of their GDP. Just imagine that a small number of people brought in that large of a percentage of their entire nation's money. Infrastructure programs were started in order to jumpstart the economy. This was partially funded by the Japanese, which is extremely controversial at the time. In 1965, South Korea sent troops to the Vietnam War. The only group that they were outnumbered by were the Americans. So they were the second largest number of population in the Vietnam War. This secured American relations, troop training, modern weapons, the much needed money for their economy. Exports rose at this time, machinery replaced manual labor, industry moved in, the economy began to grow at a faster and faster rate. And in 1979, Park Chung-hee was assassinated after a power struggle. So on May 18th, 1980, a peaceful democratic demonstration turned out, and this went violent after the military opened fire on the population and declared martial law. In 1986, direct presidential elections took place. Things begin to get better between North and South Korea, but eventually they will go bad again with a naval battle in 2002, which killed possibly 30. You have banking crisis in 2008. A South Korean ship is sunk in 2010, and an island is shelled by the North. In 2016, the president is impeached because they allowed a friend to mingle in governmental affairs. And in 2018, talks between the North and South begin cooling, and that is where we are today. North Korea. After the war, North Korea begins to develop its industrial and agricultural sectors using this Cholima movement. This boosts its economy, making it the second largest economy in Asia after Japan. Money is spent on building a massive military weapons, pursuing nuclear weapons. In 1968, the North attempts to assassinate the South Korean president, but it fails. In the 80s, the North attempts to join the South in the Olympics, but it is refused by the committee, so they sabotage it and shoot down a South Korean plane and take a bunch of people captive in a terrorist attack in an airport in Seoul. I mean, it's just crazy stuff. With the fall of the Soviet Union, which was North Korea's largest trading partner, economic support from the country begins to decline. During this time, the North attempted to reach out to America to stabilize relations, but America refused to respond. The American invasion of Iraq scared the North Koreans, as they feared an invasion of the North would soon take place. This sparked a major change in the Korean outlook, in which their nuclear program was vital to their survival. Kim Il-sung would die, and a major famine would hit in 1994, forcing the North to request food aid. While the U.S. sends aid, it does not calm fears. After the attack, the Twin Towers, in 2002, North Korea is put on the list of the axis of evil by George Bush. This only exacerbates the North's fears of an invasion, and in 2006, the North detonates its first nuclear weapon, and this begins pouring money into its ballistic missiles program. And that is really to secure its border and to defend itself against foreign nations from invading. In 2011, Kim Jong-il dies and his son Kim Jong-un becomes the new leader. In 2017, the North test fires a ballistic missile which could threaten U.S. soil. The North currently has a major UN sanctions and frozen assets around the world, severely crippling its economy. However, despite all of this, it has prevailed to become one of the few nuclear powers on the planet, and it is actually a formidable player on the world field. I was in North Korea a couple years ago. I've been to the North Korea and South Korea. Despite common beliefs, both Koreas are beautiful places with great people. It's extremely safe places to travel. Right now, North Korea has a travel ban by the U.S., which will hopefully be lifted soon. And finally, our weekly recap.
We have China becomes communist after the communists defeat the Chiang Kai-shek and his army in the Civil War. Their economy shifts from communist eventually towards an open market Leninist system, which is a capitalist economy, and they will eventually become the second largest economy after overtaking Japan. Now, Japan has an economic boom right after World War II. They eventually become the second largest economy until they are overtaken by China more recently. And finally for them, they have shifted to a limited military, which is important for future disputes. To Korea, we have Korea invaded after World War II. It's split into two separate countries. The Korean Civil War takes place. The South Koreans go from a poor region to a major economic power. They are run by a despot for a long period of time, not exactly free and democratic until rather recently. And the North Koreans have a big boom, and eventually they have economic stagnation after the fall of the Soviet Union. This kind of forces them to become a nuclear power for security reasons, mainly to fend off any foreign invasions. And that is your recap.